In a city divided by privilege and poverty, a deadly epidemic strikes without mercy. For the wealthy, salvation arrives swiftly, a vaccine promising hope and healing. But for the forgotten neighborhoods, like the East End, there's nothing but silence. Families line overcrowded hallways, children's faces pale with fever, and a small, crumbling hospital fights to hold itself together against impossible odds. At the center of it all is Dr. Ethan Brooks, a man determined to save lives even when the system has decided who gets to survive. When an anonymous crate of vaccines mysteriously appears at East End Hospital, it sets off a chain of events that pits Ethan against hospital leadership, health officials, and the limits of his own endurance. How far is he willing to go for the patients who trust him? And who sent the vaccines and why? As the lines between right and wrong blur, the fight for justice begins to ripple beyond the hospital's walls. In a community bound by hardship but lifted by kindness, hope becomes their greatest weapon. But hope alone may not be enough. The sharp hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dr. Ethan Brooks pushed open the double doors of the East End Hospital. It was a small hospital, crumbling around the edges, with paint peeling off walls and a heater that worked only half the time. Outside, the morning sun had just risen, but inside, it was chaos, an endless line of suffering that never seemed to end. The waiting room was packed beyond capacity. Mothers clutched feverish children against their chests, whispering soft words of comfort. Elderly men and women sat hunched over, their thin frames shivering in chairs that had seen better days. The smell of antiseptic mixed with sweat lingered in the air. Ethan squeezed past the rows of patients, his white coat smudged and wrinkled from yesterday's double shift. The bags beneath his eyes darkened like shadows of battles fought and lost. "Dr. Brooks, we need you in exam room 4. The voice belonged to Angela Thompson, the head nurse and Ethan's closest ally in the hospital. She stood in the doorway, her expression tense but focused, a clipboard in her hand. Ethan gave her a small nod, pushed up his sleeves, and followed her down the hall. "Who is it?" Ethan asked, his voice low and hoarse from exhaustion. "Marcus Wilkins. 10 years old. Fever's spiking. I do not like how he looks." Ethan bit the inside of his cheek. Marcus was a sweet kid, a lanky boy with large eyes, who loved to tell jokes even when he sat in this very room, struggling to breathe. Ethan had treated him for asthma and minor colds before, but this was something different. Something worse. He entered exam room 4, where Marcus lay curled on the thin examination table. His skin was slick with sweat, and his small chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Marcus's mother, a woman named Tasha with tired eyes, sat beside him, wringing her hands. Her coat was too thin for the weather, and her face looked older than her 32 years. "Dr. Brooks," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is he going to be okay?" Ethan forced a smile. "We are going to do everything we can, Tasha." He placed a hand gently on Marcus's shoulder. "Hey, champ, you hanging in there?" Marcus opened his eyes, just barely. "Hi, Doc," he whispered. "I feel like garbage." Ethan chuckled softly, though his heart ached. "Well, we cannot have that, can we? Let us take a look." He checked Marcus's vitals, and his concern grew with each passing second. The boy's fever was dangerously high, and his breathing was shallow symptoms Ethan had seen far too many times recently. "Angela, get him hooked up to fluids. I want a chest x-ray and a full panel of tests. Let us get him cooled down." Angela nodded and rushed out of the room. Tasha leaned in, her voice barely audible. "It is that sickness, isn't it? The one they're talking about on the news?" Ethan hesitated, meeting her eyes. "We're not jumping to conclusions. Not yet." But in his heart, he knew. It was the epidemic, the one spreading faster than anyone could track, and it was hitting poor neighborhoods the hardest. By mid-afternoon, the hospital was bursting at the seams. Ethan worked without pause, moving from room to room, patient to patient. The emergency room had overflowed into hallways and waiting areas. People lay on stretchers, mats, and chairs, waiting hours to be seen. Angela found him by the nurse's station, filling out paperwork. "You heard the news, didn't you?" she asked, her voice laced with frustration. Ethan didn't look up. "About the vaccine?" "Yes." The announcement had come early that morning. Scientists had developed a promising vaccine, hailed as the cure the world desperately needed. The media called it a miracle. But there was a catch. Supplies were limited, and the vaccine would first be distributed to private clinics and wealthier neighborhoods, the places that could pay for it. "They're not sending any here, Ethan," Angela said. "Not a single dose." Ethan paused, pen hovering over the chart. He clenched his jaw, anger stirring deep in his chest. "Why am I not surprised?" Angela sighed and sat beside him. "The board is already telling us to brace for it. They say we'll get what's left over if there's anything left at all." Ethan shook his head, his hands tightening into fists. "People are dying here. Children like Marcus. They cannot just ignore us." Angela looked at him with soft, understanding eyes. "They can, and they do. It's how it has always been." Ethan looked around the hospital, at the overworked nurses and the exhausted families camped in corners, and his stomach turned. The system was broken, and they were the ones who suffered most. That evening, after his shift ended, Ethan walked the few blocks to his small apartment. The East End streets were quiet now, save for the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Street lamps flickered overhead, casting dim pools of yellow light on cracked sidewalks. Ethan lived in a rundown building where the radiator rattled in the winter and the water pressure was hit or miss. His one-bedroom apartment was tidy, but sparse: a small couch, a stack of medical journals on the coffee table, and photos of his family pinned to the fridge. He had grown up in a neighborhood like this, the child of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. He dropped his bag by the door and sank onto the couch. His body ached, but his mind raced. Marcus's face haunted him, along with the faces of so many others he could not save. He turned on the television, hoping to distract himself, but the news only made things worse. The first shipments of the vaccine have arrived at select private clinics. Officials assure the public that additional doses will follow. Ethan turned the volume down and rubbed his temples. It wasn't fair. He knew it wasn't fair, but fairness had never been part of the equation. His phone buzzed beside him. It was a message from Angela. "Angela, Marcus is stable for now. I thought you'd want to know." Ethan let out a breath, relief flooding through him. He stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "Ethan, thanks, Angela. See you tomorrow." He placed the phone down and looked out the window. The city skyline loomed in the distance, bright and untouchable, like another world entirely. He thought about Tasha sitting by Marcus's bed, whispering prayers for a miracle, and the anger returned. For all their hard work, for all their sacrifices, it still wasn't enough. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Instead, he thought about what he could do, what anyone could do, when the world had decided their lives were worth less. The next morning, Ethan returned to the hospital just as the sun was rising. Outside the entrance, a line of people had already formed: men, women, and children, bundled in coats, waiting for care. A man stood by the door, handing out bottles of water. Ethan recognized him as Mr. Thompson, the owner of the corner grocery store. "You're here early, Mr. Thompson," Ethan said, stopping beside him. The older man smiled, lines creasing his weathered face. "These people need someone looking out for them, Doc-y. You're doing your part. This is mine." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the simple kindness. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mr. Thompson shrugged. "We take care of each other around here. That's how we survive." Ethan carried those words with him as he walked through the hospital doors. They echoed in his mind as he passed the crowded waiting room and the exhausted nurses who fought every day to keep the hospital afloat. We take care of each other. It was such a simple idea, but it held a kind of power Ethan couldn't ignore. Later that day, as Ethan examined Marcus again, the boy managed a weak smile. "Doc, do you think I'm going to get that shot they're talking about on TV?" Marcus asked, his voice small. Ethan looked at him. This brave little boy, who didn't deserve any of this. He knelt beside the bed, meeting Marcus's eyes. "I don't know yet, buddy," he said honestly, "but I promise you this, I'm not giving up on you, on any of you." Marcus smiled faintly. "Okay, Doc, I trust you." Ethan stood and looked out the window at the street below, where families waited, hoping for anything that could save them. Maybe the system was broken, but Ethan knew one thing for certain. If no one else was going to fight for them, he would. He had to. The next morning arrived with a brittle chill, the kind that seemed to seep through the windows of East End Hospital and settle into its very bones. Dr. Ethan Brooks walked quickly through the hallways, a coffee in one hand and Marcus's file in the other. Despite the early hour, the hospital was already teeming with life, or the desperate fight for it. "Morning, Ethan," Angela said, as she fell into step beside him. She looked as tired as he felt, dark circles carved under her eyes and her once tidy ponytail now loose and fraying. "Morning, Angela. How's Marcus?" Angela sighed and shook her head. "Stable, but that fever's hanging on. I think his mother spent the whole night praying at his bedside." Ethan nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll keep monitoring him. I'll check in after rounds." They walked into the nurses' station together, where several staff members huddled around a small television mounted on the wall. A news broadcast played, the polished anchor's voice calm and measured, almost detached. "Health officials have confirmed that the first wave of vaccine shipments will be distributed today. These doses will be allocated to private clinics and select hospitals across the city to ensure swift and controlled distribution." Angela muttered a curse under her breath. Ethan froze in place, his grip tightening on Marcus's file. "What about hospitals like ours?" a nurse whispered. The broadcast continued. A map appeared on the screen, highlighting affluent neighborhoods in glowing blue. Ethan scanned the map quickly, looking for any sign of East End or the surrounding community. There was nothing. Angela turned to him. "Ethan." "I know." His voice was clipped, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The head nurse, Linda Harris, entered the room and clapped her hands for attention. "Morning, everyone. The board has requested an urgent meeting for senior staff in 15 minutes. Dr. Brooks, you're expected to attend." "Of course," Ethan said quietly. Angela glanced at him as the others dispersed. "You're going to ask about this, aren't you?" Ethan met her gaze. "I'm not just going to ask. I'm going to fight them on it." Angela exhaled sharply and gave a small nod. "Then I've got your back." The hospital boardroom was a sharp contrast to the chaos of the floors below. It was quiet, sterile, the kind of room that smelled like fresh paper and expensive leather. A long table dominated the space, and seated at the head of it was Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the hospital's CEO. Eleanor was a woman of immaculate appearance, iron-gray hair, pinned into a flawless bun, and a tailored suit that looked as if it cost more than Ethan's yearly rent. Her expression was cool, indifferent, as she called the meeting to order. "Good morning, everyone. I'm sure you've all seen the news. We need to discuss what this means for our hospital moving forward." Ethan stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "What it means, Mrs. Hayes, is that we've been forgotten." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Brooks, that's an exaggeration." "Is it?" Ethan snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "Because I just watch the news like everyone else. East End isn't getting a single dose of the vaccine. Not one. Our patients are dying, and this hospital is bursting at the seams. How is that acceptable to you?" Eleanor's tone remained measured, almost bored. "Dr. Brooks, this is a matter of allocation and partnerships. The vaccine distribution is out of our hands. The board is working to secure additional funding so that— Funding? Ethan interrupted, incredulous. You think we need more funding? What we need are vaccines. Those vaccines have to go to where they'll be most effective, Eleanor said curtly. Controlled environments, efficient distribution. Ethan felt a sharp, bitter laugh rise in his throat. You mean private clinics and wealthy neighborhoods? Eleanor's expression hardened. This is not the time to be emotional, Dr. Brooks. I suggest you focus on what you can control, treating the patients we already have. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. How do you expect us to treat them when you refuse to fight for the resources we need? Have you seen the floors lately, Mrs. Hayes? Families are lying in hallways. Children are dying. They don't have the luxury of waiting for the board to secure funding. The room fell silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding his gaze. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. I understand your frustration, Dr. Brooks, but we must be realistic. East End is not the priority right now. Ethan felt the words like a punch to the gut. Not the priority. Before he could say another word, Eleanor straightened. That's all. Meeting adjourned. Ethan stormed out of the room, the blood pounding in his ears. Back on the floor, Ethan moved quickly from patient to patient, throwing himself into his work in an effort to suppress the anger burning in his chest. He checked on Marcus, who managed a weak smile. Hi, Doc, the boy whispered. Ethan forced a smile of his own. Hey, champ. How are you feeling? Mom says I'm getting better, Marcus replied, though his pale face told a different story. Ethan's throat tightened. That's good. Keep resting, okay? You're doing great. As he turned to leave, he found Tasha standing near the door, wringing her hands. Dr. Brooks, she said softly. Ethan paused. What is it, Tasha? Her voice wavered. Are we going to get the vaccine? I mean, for people like us? Ethan looked at her tired eyes, the fear etched into her face, and something inside him cracked. He wanted to lie, to tell her that everything would be fine, but the truth felt heavier. I don't know, Tasha, he said quietly, but I promise you I'm trying. Tasha nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. I know you're doing your best. Unexpected kindness. Ethan stood there stunned as she reached out and squeezed his arm lightly. In that small gesture, she conveyed something unspoken. Gratitude, trust, hope. And for the first time that day, the burning in his chest softened. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and cast long shadows over the East End streets, Ethan sat in the break room with Angela. You really told her off, didn't you? Angela said with a faint smile as she handed him a cup of coffee. Ethan snorted. It didn't change anything. Maybe not yet, Angela replied. But they heard you, Ethan, and that's a start. He stared into the cup, watching the steam curl into the air. I don't know how much more I can take. People like Marcus, people like Tasha, they deserve better than this. Angela leaned back, her voice soft. We'll figure it out, one day at a time. You're not in this alone, Ethan. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, he let himself believe it. As the evening grew darker, Ethan found himself standing at the window overlooking the East End streets. Small clusters of families walked together, their figures illuminated by the glow of streetlights. They looked fragile and yet strong, in a way he could not quite explain. Tasha's words echoed in his mind. Thank you. I know you're doing your best. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him why he was here. Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, he would keep fighting. For Marcus, for Tasha, for all of them. No matter how impossible it seemed. The morning after the board meeting, Ethan Brooks arrived at East End Hospital to find a group of people gathered outside. At first, he thought it was just the usual crowd patients waiting their turn to be seen. family members desperate for news. But as he got closer, he realized this was different. There were signs hastily written on cardboard. "We deserve the vaccine too. Every life matter. Help the forgotten communities." The voices were still quiet, but the determination was clear. Ethan paused at the edge of the sidewalk, taking it in. Mothers stood shoulder to shoulder, holding their children's hands. Young men and women clutched signs, their faces resolute. Old Mr. Thompson, the grocery store owner, stood near the front, waving people in as they trickled over from neighboring streets. Ethan's heart tightened. These were his people, his neighbors, and here they were, demanding to be seen. "Dr. Brooks!" The voice startled him, and he turned to see Angela hurrying toward him, her coat pulled tightly against the cold. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, though he already had a good idea. Angela's breath puffed in the chilly air. "Word spread overnight. People are angry, Ethan. They're scared. The whole neighborhood knows about the vaccines, and how East End got nothing. Some of the community leaders organized this protest." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "Is it peaceful?" "So far, yeah," Angela said. "But it's only a matter of time before the media catches wind, or the wrong people." Ethan looked back at the crowd. A little boy perched on his father's shoulders held up a crooked sign that read, "Give us a chance." The message was so simple, so heartbreaking, that Ethan felt his chest tighten. Angela placed a hand on his arm. "You're thinking about joining them, aren't you?" Ethan sighed and shook his head. "No, I'm thinking about how bad this could get if no one listens." "They're already not listening," Angela said softly. Ethan met her eyes. "Then maybe it's time to make them hear." Inside the hospital, things were no better than the day before. The waiting room overflowed, the halls crowded with stretchers and weary families. Ethan threw himself into his work, trying to block out the images of the protest outside. He treated patient after patient, though supplies were running lower by the hour. Around noon, he checked on Marcus. The boy looked worse. His fever remained stubborn, and his breathing had grown labored. Tasha sat beside him, murmuring a quiet prayer, her hands folded tightly. "Dr. Brooks," she said softly when she saw him. "Any news about the vaccine?" Ethan hesitated. How many times could he deliver the same answer? Not yet. He hated how hollow it sounded. "I'm working on it, Tasha," he said finally, his voice steady. "I promise you I'm not giving up." Tasha looked up at him, tears pooling in her eyes. "I know you're trying. You're the only one who is." Those words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He turned away quickly, checking Marcus's vitals to hide the emotion on his face. He had always been able to hold himself together, at least until now. By mid-afternoon, the sound of chanting outside began to grow louder. Ethan could hear it even through the thick hospital walls. He found himself peering out the window between patients, watching as the crowd slowly swelled. Angela appeared beside him. "It's getting bigger," she said quietly. "I can see that. They're asking for you, Ethan." Ethan turned to her. "What?" Angela sighed. "The protesters. A couple of them came to the front desk asking to talk to you. They know you're fighting for them. You've become a symbol, I guess." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his pulse quickening. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't want to be anyone's symbol. He just wanted to do his job. But when he glanced back at the crowd, he saw a woman holding her child, the same child he had treated for pneumonia weeks ago. He saw Mr. Thompson, still handing out water to the protesters. He saw people. He knew people he cared about standing in the cold because no one else would stand for them. "I'll talk to them," Ethan said quietly. Angela raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I need to." Ethan stepped out into the cold, squinting as the afternoon sunlight hit his face. The crowd hushed when they saw him, and a ripple of murmurs moved through the group. Mr. Thompson waved him over with a small, encouraging nod. Ethan moved to the front, his heart pounding as dozens of eyes turned toward him. A woman holding a microphone stepped forward. She introduced herself as Monica Green, a local community leader Ethan had seen at town halls. Her voice was strong and clear as she addressed him. "Dr. Brooks," she said, "we know you've been fighting for this hospital. We've seen you working day and night for our families. But now we need answers. Why are we being left behind?" Ethan took a deep breath, his breath forming a faint cloud in the air. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, the mothers, the fathers, the children bundled against the cold, and spoke. "You're being left behind because no one's listening," he said simply, his voice carrying through the silence. "I wish I could tell you that the system works, that help is coming, but I won't lie to you. The truth is, we are not a priority to the people making decisions." A low murmur moved through the crowd. Monica raised her microphone again. "So what do we do, Dr. Brooks? How do we change that?" Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "We don't give up. You've already taken the first step just by being here, by showing up, by making your voices heard. But this fight isn't going to be easy. It's going to take all of us working together, refusing to be ignored." From the crowd, a voice shouted, "What about you, Doc? Are you going to fight with us?" Ethan looked out at the people before him, his chest swelling with emotion. "I've been fighting for you every day," he said, "and I'm not stopping now." A cheer erupted from the crowd. It was small at first, but it grew louder, stronger, until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Ethan felt a weight lift off his chest as he looked out at the sea of determined faces. For the first time in weeks, he saw hope. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Ethan stood by the hospital entrance, watching the crowd begin to disperse. Angela joined him, hands stuffed into her coat pockets. "You made quite the speech out there," she said with a grin. "I didn't plan on it," Ethan replied, shaking his head. "It just felt right." Angela glanced at him. "You gave them hope, Ethan. That matters." He nodded slowly, staring out at the streets. "Now we need to figure out how to back it up." Angela tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Ethan turned to her, his expression set with quiet resolve. "If they won't give us the vaccines, we'll find another way to help these people. We have to." Angela studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Well, you're not doing it alone. I'm with you." Ethan looked at her and felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For all the things that were broken, for all the doors that had been shut, there were still people like Angela, like Mr. Thompson, like Monica Green, people who refused to give up. "Thank you," Ethan said softly. Angela nudged him lightly. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long fight ahead of us." Ethan smiled faintly, looking back at the hospital. "Then we'd better get ready." As the night deepened, the East End streets fell quiet again, but the spark had been lit. For the first time in a long time, the forgotten community had a voice. And Ethan Brooks knew he would do whatever it took to make sure they were heard. The day after the protest, Ethan stood at the hospital window, staring out over the East End streets. The energy of yesterday's demonstration still lingered in his mind, the crowd's cheers, the hope in their voices. But alongside that hope, a bitter truth gnawed at him. Words alone wouldn't save anyone. Not Marcus, not Tasha, not the dozens of families waiting for a chance to live. Angela's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're not listening to me." Ethan turned from the window. "Sorry, what is it?" She held out a clipboard. "Lab results on Marcus. It's getting worse. His lungs are starting to fill up." Ethan's shoulders tensed. "How long does he have?" Angela hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "If we can't control the fever and infection, maybe a day or two." Ethan clenched his fists. He felt helpless, like the air was being squeezed from his lungs. "He needs that vaccine." "And so do hundreds of others," Angela said softly. But if we can't get it, her voice trailed off. They both knew what would happen. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he pulled on his coat and grabbed his stethoscope. "Where are you going?" Angela asked. "To find answers," Ethan replied. "Or at least try." The private clinic was a 20-minute drive across the city, but it felt like another world. Ethan had never been there before, but the reputation of Riverside Medical Center preceded it. It was a luxury clinic, an oasis for the wealthy known for its pristine facilities and concierge-style healthcare. When Ethan stepped through the front doors, he felt like he'd entered a museum instead of a hospital. The floors were polished marble, gleaming under delicate pendant lights. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air, and the waiting room had actual leather armchairs, not the plastic folding chairs his patients had to endure. At the front desk, a receptionist with a perfect smile greeted him. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you have an appointment?" Ethan swallowed his irritation. "No, I need to speak with Dr. Jonathan Reese." The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Reese is in high demand. Do you have a referral?" "I'm Dr. Ethan Brooks," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "I'm here to talk about the vaccine." She hesitated, her smile faltering slightly as she sized him up, his wrinkled coat, his tired face. "One moment, please." Ethan stepped back as she picked up the phone. He glanced around, taking in the stark differences. There were no crying children here, no exhausted mothers, no stretchers lining the halls. The silence was unnerving. "Dr. Reese will see you now," the receptionist finally said. "Second door on the left." Ethan made his way down the hall and knocked once before stepping into the office. Dr. Jonathan Reese sat behind a massive desk, a picture of composure in his tailored suit and gold-rimmed glasses. He looked up with mild surprise. "Ethan Brooks, I didn't expect to see you here." Ethan crossed his arms. "I didn't think I'd have to come." Reese leaned back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't waste time. "We need the vaccine, Jonathan. East End Hospital didn't get a single dose. People are dying." Reese sighed, as though this conversation was an inconvenience. "You think I control vaccine distribution? I don't." "Maybe not," Ethan shot back. "But you're getting shipments here. Extra doses. I've seen the reports." Reese tilted his head, his expression still unreadable. "And you think I'm just going to hand them over to you?" Ethan stepped closer, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "People in my hospital, children, don't have days, Jonathan. We're improvising treatments. We're running out of medicine. You don't need all the doses you're sitting on." Reese gave him a long look before responding. "Ethan, listen to me. This is about control. If we give vaccines to the wrong places, if distribution isn't carefully planned, we lose control. Panic spreads. It's about managing priorities." "Managing priorities?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "You mean picking winners and losers? You think East End doesn't deserve the same care as these people?" He gestured to the clinic's polished hallways. Reese's expression hardened. "That's not what I said." "No, but it's what you mean," Ethan snapped. "You see my patients as numbers on a spreadsheet, not as people. People with lives, families." Reese sat forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "It's not as simple as you think." "It's exactly that simple," Ethan said, his voice tight. "You're choosing who lives and who dies." Reese's calm veneer finally cracked, his voice sharper than before. "Don't lecture me, Ethan. You think you're the only doctor who cares about his patients? I'm following the rules. Maybe you should try it." Ethan stared at him, his jaw tight. "I'm trying to save lives." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Reese exhaled, adjusting his glasses. "This conversation is over." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "You're a coward, Jonathan. You're sitting here with everything you need while people are dying 5 miles away." Reese didn't respond. Ethan turned and walked out, his heart pounding with anger. By the time Ethan returned to East End, The sky had darkened into shades of orange and purple. He sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He thought about Marcus lying in his hospital bed, about Tasha's tired face, and then he thought about the pristine clinic, about Jonathan Reese sitting behind that desk, untouched by the chaos. The world was broken. He had always known that, but now he could see it with perfect clarity. He stepped out of the car and made his way toward the hospital entrance. As he walked, a familiar voice called out to him, "Dr. Brooks." Ethan turned to see Mr. Thompson, the grocery store owner, standing beside the building with a small group of community volunteers. They were unloading crates from the back of a beat-up pickup truck. "Mr. Thompson?" Ethan asked, approaching. "What is all this?" Mr. Thompson grinned and wiped his hands on his coat. "Supplies. Some folks from the neighborhood pitched in. You've got water bottles, canned food for families waiting, even a few blankets. Thought it might help." Ethan stared at the crates, stunned. Why would you?" Mr. Thompson patted his shoulder. "You fight for us, Docky, so we're fighting for you. We're all in this together." Ethan swallowed hard. He felt something catch in his throat as he looked at the volunteers, ordinary people who had nothing to give, and yet were still giving everything. Angela appeared at his side, her eyes wide as she took in the crates. "Ethan, this is incredible." Ethan nodded, his voice soft. "Yeah, it is." Mr. Thompson grinned. "It's not much, but kindness goes a long way. Besides, I figured you could use a little hope." Ethan smiled faintly. "We all could." Later that night, after helping distribute the supplies to families camped out in the waiting room, Ethan sat at Marcus's bedside. The boy's breathing was still labored, his small chest rising and falling unevenly. Tasha dozed in a chair nearby, her hand still resting on Marcus's arm. Ethan gently touched the boy's forehead, brushing back his damp hair. "Hang in there, buddy," he whispered. "We're not giving up on you." As he sat there in the quiet room, surrounded by the soft hum of machines, he thought about Mr. Thompson and the volunteers, about their kindness and resilience, even in the face of so much suffering. Maybe they didn't have vaccines, maybe they didn't have resources, but they had each other. Ethan stood and looked out the window at the darkened streets, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. "We're all in this together." The words echoed in his mind. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to believe it. The fluorescent lights flickered above the nurse's station as Ethan Brooks flipped through a stack of charts. It was well past midnight, but sleep felt like a luxury he could not afford. The hospital was quiet now, save for the faint beeping of monitors and the distant shuffle of nurses checking on patients. Ethan had just come from Marcus's room, where the boy's breathing remained shallow, but he was holding on. Barely. Angela appeared beside him, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You need this more than I do," she said, handing one over. Ethan accepted it with a tired smile. "I think I've forgotten what sleep feels like." Angela sipped her coffee and looked at him seriously. "So what now? You went to Riverside. That didn't exactly work out." Ethan let out a bitter chuckle. "Understatement of the year. Jonathan Reese practically threw me out of the building." "And East End is still empty-handed," Angela said quietly, her words heavy with the weight of their situation. Ethan ran a hand over his face, his stubble rough against his palm. "We're on our own." Angela sat on the edge of the desk and crossed her arms. "Then let's act like it. We can't get the vaccines, but we can do something else." Ethan looked at her. "What do you mean?" Angela leaned closer, her voice low but firm. "We improvise, just like we always do. The community's rallying behind us, Ethan. Mr. Thompson and his group proved that. Let's reach out and start organizing, find supplies, use volunteers. If no one's going to save us, we save ourselves." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, her words sinking in. She was right. They had no other choice. He nodded slowly, determination replacing the exhaustion in his eyes. "Okay, let's get to work." The next morning, East End Hospital buzzed with a different kind of energy. Angela had already spread the word, and volunteers began arriving in small waves, members of the community, eager to help. The waiting room was still overcrowded, but now people had blankets donated from Mr. Thompson's group. Families shared water bottles and canned food, while nurses and medical students moved swiftly through the halls. Ethan gathered the small group of volunteers in the staff break room, using a whiteboard to sketch out their plan. "We're going to organize this into 3 teams," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Team 1 will focus on supplies, blankets, bottled water, food, anything to keep families comfortable while they wait. Team 2 will help us set up makeshift treatment areas. If we're going to survive this, we need more space." "And Team 3? A young volunteer asked. Ethan's gaze hardened. "Team 3 is going to help me find medicine. We might not have the vaccine, but we'll track down antibiotics, oxygen tanks, anything we can get our hands on. We'll reach out to clinics, pharmacies, and anyone willing to donate." Angela stood beside him, her presence strong and reassuring. "It's going to be hard," she added, "but if we stick together, we can make a difference. A small difference, maybe, but right now, even small victories matter." The group murmured in agreement. Ethan could see the hope in their faces, the spark of determination. These weren't medical professionals or hospital administrators. They were shop owners, teachers, and teenagers from the East End neighborhood, ordinary people ready to fight for their community. "Let's get started," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We don't have time to waste." As the day stretched into evening, the hospital transformed. Volunteers carried extra chairs and tables into the lobby, creating makeshift treatment zones where nurses could check vitals and provide basic care. Angela supervised the setup, her voice ringing out as she directed people where to go. The younger volunteers moved like clockwork, distributing food and blankets to families waiting in the halls. Meanwhile, Ethan made calls. He started with the local clinics and pharmacies, explaining their dire need for supplies. Most calls ended the same way: apologies, excuses, and rejection. But he refused to give up. He was in the middle of a call when Angela appeared at the door, her expression urgent. "Ethan, we've got something." He hung up quickly. "What is it?" "Monica Green," Angela said, referring to the community leader from the protest. "She just called. She knows someone who works at a pharmaceutical supply warehouse across town. They've got surplus antibiotics and oxygen tank stuff they're not using." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch?" "They're not allowed to give it away officially," Angela replied. "But Monica's contact is willing to look the other way." Ethan felt a flicker of hope. "How do we get it?" Angela hesitated. "We'll have to pick it up ourselves. Tonight." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Let's go." That night, Ethan and Angela drove across town in an old van borrowed from Mr. Thompson. The streets were quiet, the city asleep. Ethan gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. The risks were clear. If they were caught taking supplies unofficially, it could cost him his medical license. But the thought of Marcus lying in that hospital bed, struggling to breathe, was enough to silence his doubts. Angela broke the silence. "You okay?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "If we pull this off, we'll save lives. That's all that matters." Angela gave a small nod. "You're doing the right thing, Ethan, even if no one else sees it." They pulled into the warehouse lot just after midnight. Monica Green was already there, her car idling beside the chain-link fence. She waved them over. "This is the place," she said quietly. "My contact is inside. He's leaving the supplies in the loading dock. You've got 15 minutes before the security team makes their next round." Ethan nodded. "Got it." He and Angela climbed out of the van and hurried to the loading dock. The warehouse loomed above them, massive and silent. True to Monica's word, crates of supplies had been left on wooden pallets near the doors. Ethan opened one of the boxes, his heart leaping when he saw rows of oxygen tanks inside. "Let's move," Angela said, grabbing one end of the first crate. They worked quickly, carrying the boxes to the van one by one. The cold air burned Ethan's lungs, but adrenaline pushed him forward. His hands were numb by the time they loaded the last box. Angela slammed the back doors shut and turned to him. "We did it!" Ethan leaned against the van, catching his breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of victory. "Let's get this back to the hospital." When they returned to East End Hospital just before dawn, the volunteers were still working, cleaning, organizing, and helping families settle in for the night. Ethan and Angela unloaded the supplies with the help of a few nurses, who looked at the boxes with disbelief. "Where did this come from?" one of them asked. "Don't ask questions," Angela replied, grinning. "Just start distributing it." By sunrise, the hospital had changed. Patients who had been struggling to breathe now had access to oxygen. Antibiotics were being administered to those with secondary infections. Families were sleeping under donated blankets, their exhaustion softened by the first shred of hope they'd seen in weeks. Ethan stood in the middle of it all, watching as the hospital began to hum with quiet relief. Angela appeared beside him, her face glowing with exhaustion and pride. "You did it," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "We did it. All of us." At that moment, Mr. Thompson walked through the doors carrying a box of food. He caught Ethan's eye and smiled. "Looks like you're making miracles happen, Doc." Ethan smiled back. "No, just trying to keep my promises." Mr. Thompson nodded. "That's enough." As Ethan looked around the hospital at the volunteers, the nurses, and the families holding on, he realized something. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting. Together. For the first time in a long time, he believed they could win. The sunrise cast thin streaks of gold through the windows of East End Hospital, but the light did little to brighten the weight in the air. Despite the overnight relief brought by the supplies Ethan and Angela secured, the cracks were still visible. Oxygen tanks were rationed, antibiotics were carefully measured, and the line of patients continued to grow outside. Ethan stood at the edge of the hallway, watching a nurse administer oxygen to a young woman who had arrived overnight. Her shallow breaths filled the mask, her eyes closed in exhaustion. Ethan checked his watch. There was still no vaccine shipment in sight. Angela walked up beside him, holding a clipboard. "We used 2/3 of the oxygen already. Some of the antibiotics are nearly gone too." Ethan exhaled, trying to suppress the growing tension in his chest. "We need more time." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Time doesn't care about us, Ethan. These people can't wait." Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. "We'll figure it out. We have to." Marcus's condition had taken a sharp turn by mid-morning. When Ethan walked into room 4, the small boy was curled on his side, his breathing labored and shallow. Tasha sat beside him, wiping his face with a damp cloth, her silent prayers almost audible in the quiet room. Ethan forced a smile as he approached. "Hey, buddy, you're a fighter, aren't you?" Marcus didn't respond. He opened his eyes briefly, looking at Ethan before they fluttered shut again. Tasha looked up at Ethan, her face streaked with tears. "He's getting worse, Dr. Brooks." Her voice trembled. "You said you wouldn't give up on him. Please." Ethan's throat tightened. He knelt beside the bed and gently took Marcus's hand. It felt so small, so fragile. "I'm not giving up, Tasha. I promise you." Tasha nodded weakly, but Ethan could see the fear consuming her, the kind of fear that only came when you were powerless to save someone you loved. By the afternoon, the hospital's fragile system began to buckle under the weight of its reality. More patients arrived. Ethan saw families he recognized, faces from the protest, neighbors from the East End streets clutching their loved ones as they pleaded for help. The nurses worked tirelessly, but resources were running out. They didn't have enough beds, enough medicine, or enough staff to keep up. Ethan paced the hallways, trying to think. Each step echoed his frustration. How could he keep this place together when it was already broken? Angela found him near the emergency entrance, her face pale with worry. "We're losing a patient in exam room 2. If we don't get him on oxygen, he won't make it." Ethan froze. "We're out of tanks?" Angela nodded. "We're down to 1, and we're already sharing it between 2 other patients." A sharp weight dropped into Ethan's chest. He glanced at the waiting room, where dozens of people sat slumped in chairs, pale and coughing. They were all depending on him, on all of them, but there was no way to save them all. Angela's voice broke through his thoughts. "What do we do?" Ethan looked at her, his expression hollow. "We keep trying. That's all we can do." Angela turned quickly, but not before he saw the tears in her eyes. By evening, the waiting room had descended into quiet chaos. The line of patients spilled into the hallways, families murmuring prayers or sitting silently in shock. A teenage boy lay on the floor beside his mother, curled into a ball as his fever racked his body. Across the room, an elderly man held his wife's hand as she fought to stay awake. Ethan watched it all, and something inside him cracked. He had spent his whole life believing in the system that if you worked hard enough, if you fought hard enough, you could make things right. But here he was, standing in the middle of his crumbling hospital, powerless to do anything more. "Dr. Brooks!" The urgent voice pulled him back, and he turned to see Angela hurrying toward him. "What is it?" Ethan asked. She stopped to catch her breath, her face flushed with anger. "Eleanor Hayes, she's here." Ethan blinked. "Here?" Angela nodded, her jaw tight. "In your office. She wants to see you." Ethan's pulse quickened. What could Eleanor possibly want now? With a deep breath, he moved through the halls, past nurses and volunteers who barely noticed him. When he reached his office, Eleanor Hayes was already sitting in his chair, waiting. She looked up as he entered, her expression cold and unreadable. "Dr. Brooks." "Mrs. Hayes," Ethan said, his voice clipped. "What brings you here? Finally decided to see what's happening in your hospital?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow but didn't respond to the jab. Instead, she placed a manila folder on the desk and pushed it toward him. "Sit." Ethan didn't move. "I don't have time for games, Eleanor." "This isn't a game," she replied sharply. "I know what you've been doing. The warehouse supplies, the volunteers, the improvised treatment areas. Do you have any idea how reckless this is?" Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "Reckless? You think trying to save lives is reckless?" "You're breaking protocols," Eleanor snapped. "You've overstepped. If the health department hears about this, it could shut the hospital down. And you, Dr. Brooks, could lose everything." Ethan stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "You've seen what's happening here. You know how many people are dying. And you have the audacity to sit there and lecture me about protocols?" Eleanor's expression remained calm, her voice cold. "This isn't personal, Dr. Brooks. It's about order." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "Order? The only order here is that the poor die while people like you sit back and watch." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Careful, Ethan. You're walking a dangerous line." Ethan stared at her, his chest rising and falling. "You're the one who left us to die. If you want to fire me, do it. I don't care anymore." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment before turning toward the door. "You'll care when you realize how much you stand to lose." Without another word, she walked out, leaving Ethan alone in the silence of his office. That night, Ethan sat in the empty break room, his head in his hands. Angela found him there hours later, a cup of coffee in her hand. "Eleanor's a coward," she said quietly. "You know that, right?" Ethan didn't look up. "She's right about one thing. If the state finds out what we're doing, it could shut us down." Angela sat across from him. "And what happens if we stop? What happens to the people out there?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression tired but determined. "They die." Angela nodded. "Then we keep going." Ethan let out a shaky breath. "It feels like we're losing, Angela." Angela reached across the table and placed a hand on his arm. We're not losing. Not yet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The break room was silent, save for the faint hum of the building around them. Marcus needs us, Angela said softly. And so does everyone else. Ethan closed his eyes, nodding slowly. Okay, tomorrow we keep going. As they sat there together, the weight of the day pressing down on them, a quiet resolve settled over Ethan. The odds were impossible, the fight unfair, but there was no choice. They would keep going, because giving up was not an option. The morning began with a chill that clung to the air, seeping through the cracks of East End Hospital's old windows. Dr. Ethan Brooks was already awake, standing at the foot of Marcus's bed. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythms. It was a sound that haunted him. Tasha sat slumped in a chair nearby, her face hollow with exhaustion. Her hands rested on Marcus's small arm, as if willing her strength into him. She looked up when she noticed Ethan and managed a weak smile. "He's still fighting, Doc." Ethan nodded, though his heart ached. He's a tough kid. But inside, he knew Marcus's fight was slipping. The oxygen they'd brought in had bought them time just a little. The antibiotics helped, but without the vaccine, the infection would win. Marcus needed more than what Ethan had to offer. The hopelessness was becoming a heavy weight on his shoulders. For the first time since this all started, Ethan wondered if the fight might be too big for him. Ethan hadn't yet left Marcus's room when Angela burst in. Breathless. "Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of urgency and confusion. "You need to see this." "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Just come," she said, pulling him out of the room and into the hallway. Together, they rushed down the corridor to the staff entrance, where a handful of nurses and volunteers were gathered, whispering. Ethan followed their gaze and froze when he saw it. A large crate, unmarked except for one glaring label, "Restricted Distribution." It sat near the doorway, as though someone had dropped it off in the middle of the night and disappeared without a trace. Angela stepped forward and kicked at the corner of the crate gently, testing its weight. "Who sent this? Do we know what's inside?" Ethan asked. The group fell silent. A young nurse shook her head. "It was just there when we opened up this morning. No note. No nothing." Angela looked at Ethan. "You think it's—" Ethan didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed a crowbar from the supply closet and wedged it beneath the crate's lid. With a grunt, he pried the wood free. The group around him held their breath. Inside the crate, packed carefully in insulated foam, were rows of small glass vials. Ethan picked one up, his hands trembling. His eyes scanned the label, and he felt the breath rush from his lungs. "Vaccine shipment, 27B." The words blurred as he stared at them. It was real. They were holding the very thing that could save Marcus and so many others. "It's the vaccine," Angela whispered, stunned. A cheer erupted from the small group of staff, quiet but filled with pure relief. Ethan turned the vial in his hand, still in disbelief. "Who sent this?" he muttered again, his voice low. Angela shook her head, her face unreadable. "Does it matter?" Ethan paused, looking back at the crate. It did matter. Someone had bypassed protocols, someone had risked a lot to get this here. It couldn't have been the board. It certainly wasn't Eleanor Hayes, but whoever it was had given them something precious, something they didn't deserve to waste. Ethan looked up, his voice suddenly sharp. "Get the nurses ready. I want this organized. We vaccinate Marcus first, then the other critical patients. No chaos. Do you understand me?" Angela nodded, already snapping into action. "We're on it." Ethan held the first dose in his hand as he entered Marcus's room. Tasha sat up straight when she saw him, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "Is that—" she started. "It's the vaccine," Ethan said quietly, kneeling beside the bed. "We got it." Tasha let out a sob, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "Thank you, God," she whispered. Ethan turned to Marcus, who was still too weak to open his eyes. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "We're going to give you something to help. You're going to get stronger, okay?" He administered the dose carefully, his hands steady. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a flicker of control return to him. He couldn't save everyone, but maybe he could save Marcus. When he stepped out into the hallway, Angela was waiting for him. "How's he doing?" she asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. "We'll see. It's going to take time." Angela gave him a small smile. "It's a start." The hospital buzzed with quiet energy as the nurses began administering the vaccines. Critical patients received doses first, children like Marcus, the elderly, and those with the most severe symptoms. Ethan moved from room to room, overseeing the process. In the waiting room, families whispered prayers of gratitude, their faces brightened by a hope that had been absent for far too long. A volunteer approached Ethan, holding a clipboard. "Dr. Brooks, we've already used about half of the doses. Should we expand to the next group?" Ethan hesitated. The crate held enough vials to help dozens, but not everyone. If they weren't careful, it wouldn't be enough. "Prioritize the sickest first," he said firmly. "We'll figure out the rest later." Angela appeared at his side, her expression cautious. "What if this is the only shipment we get? What if no more comes?" Ethan met her gaze. "Then we use what we have to buy us time. We're not wasting a single dose." Angela nodded, understanding his resolve. Late that evening, as the last of the vaccines were distributed, Ethan sat at Marcus's bedside once more. The boy's breathing had steadied, though he still looked fragile, his small body pale against the white sheets. Tasha rested her head against the mattress, her eyes closed, her hand still holding Marcus's. Angela stepped quietly into the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Ethan and sat beside him. "He's looking better," she said softly. Ethan stared at Marcus, watching the rise and fall of his chest. "He's not out of the woods yet, but it's a start." Angela leaned back in her chair, her voice quieter now. "You know what people are saying, right? About the crate. About you?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" Angela smiled faintly. "You're a hero now, Ethan. People are calling it a miracle." Ethan shook his head, his voice low. "I'm no hero. I'm just doing my job." Angela studied him for a moment. "Maybe. But you gave them hope when no one else would. That counts for something." Ethan looked down at his coffee, letting her words settle. He didn't feel like a hero, not when so many people were still waiting, still suffering. But he had given Marcus a chance, and that had to matter. Outside the window, the East End streets were dark, but they were alive. Families lingered under streetlights, their laughter soft and warm as the cold wind blew past. The city hadn't changed overnight, but the weight in the air felt lighter. Angela stood and stretched. "Get some rest, Ethan. You've earned it." Ethan nodded, though he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. As Angela left, he turned back to Marcus and sat quietly, listening to the steady sound of the boy's breathing. In the silence, Ethan whispered to himself, "Maybe miracles do happen." The next morning, Ethan found a small envelope slipped under the door to his office. He opened it carefully, his fingers brushing against the paper. Inside was a single note, typed and unsigned. "Do what's right. More will come." Ethan stared at the words, his mind racing. Who had sent the crate? Was it someone from the board, a stranger, or someone who had witnessed the protests and acted? He didn't know. But as he slipped the note into his pocket, Ethan realized it didn't matter. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, he felt like they had a chance. The morning light streamed through the thin blinds in Ethan Brooks's office, but the warmth did little to soften the weight in the room. Ethan sat at his desk, turning the note over in his hands. "Do what's right. More will come." It had been hours since he found it, and his mind still swirled with questions. Who had sent the vaccine shipment? Could they rely on more? Or was this a one-time act of defiance? A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ethan glanced up to see Angela stepping inside, her expression guarded. "You've got company," she said softly. "Who is it?" Angela hesitated. "Eleanor Hayes, and she's not alone." Ethan felt his stomach drop. He set the note down and stood, his pulse already quickening. How bad is this going to be? Angela looked at him with a mix of sympathy and worry. "I'd say pretty bad." Eleanor Hayes stood in the center of the boardroom when Ethan walked in. The hospital CEO looked as pristine as ever, her iron gray hair pinned perfectly in place, her tailored suit untouched by the chaos outside. Beside her stood two men in suits, one of whom Ethan recognized as an official from the state health department. "Dr. Brooks," Eleanor said coolly, gesturing for him to take a seat. Ethan ignored the invitation, choosing to stand. "What's this about, Mrs. Hayes?" Her sharp gaze landed on him. "You already know what this is about." The state official stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Dr. Brooks, we've received reports that your hospital has been distributing vaccines obtained through unofficial means. There's no record of East End Hospital receiving a sanctioned shipment." Ethan's jaw tightened, his voice steady. "We didn't steal anything, if that's what you're suggesting." "That's not the point," Eleanor cut in. "The point is that your actions, reckless as they are, having jeopardized this hospital. Do you understand the position you've put us in?" Ethan turned to her, his voice rising. "The position I've put us in? You're the one who refused to fight for this hospital in the first place. You left us to fend for ourselves." The health official raised a hand to interrupt. "Dr. Brooks, no one is questioning your intentions, but the fact remains that vaccines were distributed here without authorization. This could have consequences, legal consequences for you and for the hospital." Ethan stared at them, disbelieving. "Legal consequences? Are you serious? People were dying, and you're worried about paperwork?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "I'm worried about the future of this hospital, Dr. Brooks. If we're shut down, no one here gets care." Ethan shook his head. "People aren't getting care now. Not the care they deserve. We saved lives this week, lives that you were willing to ignore." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick in the air. The health official cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, we need answers. Where did the vaccines come from?" Ethan met his gaze evenly. "I don't know." The official frowned. "You're saying you have no idea how a crate of restricted vaccines ended up at your hospital?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "It was left here anonymously. I didn't ask questions because I didn't have time to. I had sick patients to care for." Eleanor turned to the health official. "Do you see? This is exactly the recklessness I was referring to. Dr. Brooks has been acting without oversight for weeks now. If we don't take control of this situation, we risk losing everything." Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "You're not upset about oversight, Eleanor. You're upset that people are starting to look at you and see the truth." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Watch yourself, Dr. Brooks." The health official spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "We'll need to investigate the matter. In the meantime, Dr. Brooks, you are to step back from your duties until this is resolved." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You're suspending me?" "It's not a suspension," the man replied quickly. "It's a precaution." Ethan looked at Eleanor, searching for any sign of humanity in her face. "You're letting this happen?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm doing what's best for the hospital." "No," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "You're doing what's easiest for you." No one replied. The health official gathered his papers, and Eleanor turned sharply on her heel, walking out of the boardroom without another word. Ethan stood alone for a moment, the room suddenly too quiet, too empty. Angela found him in his office 10 minutes later. She didn't knock, she just walked in, her face a storm of anger. They can't do this, Ethan, she said. They can't just take you out like this. Ethan sat slumped at his desk, his hands folded tightly in front of him. They can, Angela. And they just did. Angela pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. So, what now? Are you just going to roll over and let them win? Ethan looked up, his eyes dark. Do I have a choice? Yes, Angela said fiercely. You always have a choice. He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. They'll shut this place down if we push them. And if that happens, what's the point? All those people out there, they'll have nowhere to go. Angela leaned closer, her voice softer now. You're not the only one fighting, Ethan. Look outside. Look at what we've built these past few days. You think they're going to let this place fall apart without a fight? Ethan glanced out the window. Below, he could see the volunteers moving through the halls, passing out blankets, delivering food, checking on families. He saw the nurses he'd worked alongside for years, their determination undiminished even in the face of so many losses. And then there was Marcus, whose life was hanging on because of a crate of vaccines that shouldn't have been there, but somehow, miraculously, was. Angela smiled faintly. We're not done yet, Ethan, not by a long shot. Ethan looked back at her, the fire returning to his eyes. Then we keep going. Angela nodded. Yeah, we do. That evening, Ethan left the hospital through the side entrance, avoiding the main lobby. He didn't want to see Eleanor, didn't want to feel the judgment in the bored stares. The cold air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, and for a moment, he stood there breathing it in. A familiar voice called out to him. Dr. Brooks! Ethan turned to see Mr. Thompson standing by the curb, holding a small crate of groceries. He smiled warmly. Long day, Doc? Ethan chuckled softly. Something like that. Mr. Thompson walked over, his expression serious. You know, people around here are talking. They know what you've done. They know you're fighting for them. Ethan looked down, shaking his head. It doesn't feel like enough. Mr. Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder. It's more than enough. You gave us hope when no one else would. That means something, Doc. Don't forget it. Ethan felt the tightness in his chest ease just a little. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. The older man nodded, his face softening into a smile. We're not giving up on you, Doc. So don't you give up on us. Ethan stood there for a moment after Mr. Thompson walked away, the cold wind tugging at his coat. He thought about what Angela had said earlier about the fight not being over. She was right. As he turned and walked back toward his car, Ethan Brooks knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't stop fighting. Not for Marcus, not for Tasha, not for anyone who depended on him. Ethan's suspension sent ripples through East End Hospital like a stone dropped into still water. Word spread quickly through whispers in the hallways, shared glances among nurses, and worried murmurs from patients' families. It was as if the fight had been momentarily knocked out of them. Ethan wasn't just their doctor, he was their voice, their hope. And now he was gone. Angela sat quietly in the break room, staring at her cold coffee. She'd spent hours trying to keep things running, fielding questions about Ethan's absence. People wanted answers, but she had none to give. One of the young volunteers, Devon, a college student who had been helping set up the makeshift treatment areas, poked his head into the room. Nurse Thompson? Angela looked up, exhausted. What is it? There's someone here to see you, Devon said, scratching his head. She says it's important. Angela sighed and stood. If it's another board member, tell them I'm busy. It's not. Devon lowered his voice. It's a reporter. She says she wants to talk about Dr. Brooks. Angela's eyebrows shot up. A reporter? Devon nodded. Yeah, from Channel 7 News. Angela found the reporter standing in the hospital lobby, notebook in hand. She was young, sharp-eyed, and looked slightly out of place among the chaos of East End. Her name tag read, Rachel Murphy. Angela approached her warily. You're looking for me? Rachel turned and smiled politely. Nurse Angela Thompson? I've been hearing a lot about East End Hospital lately, about the protest, the vaccine crate, and, well, about Dr. Ethan Brooks. Angela crossed her arms. Why are you here, Ms. Murphy? Rachel's expression softened. Because people deserve to know what's really happening here. I've been following the vaccine rollout across the city. Private clinics are stocked, and hospitals in wealthier neighborhoods are sitting on surplus doses. Meanwhile, hospitals like yours are being left out. It's not right. Angela studied her, searching for signs of insincerity, but all she found was determination. And what do you want from me? I want to hear the truth, Rachel said. Tell me about what's happening at this hospital. About Dr. Brooks. Help me tell your story. Angela hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. She knew how dangerous it was to poke the bear, especially when the hospital board was already breathing down their necks. But then she thought about Marcus, about Tasha, about every family waiting for a miracle in these halls. If they stayed silent, nothing would change. Angela exhaled. Fine. Follow me. Rachel followed Angela through the hospital, notebook in hand, her gaze sharp as she took in the crowded hallways, the makeshift treatment zones, and the families camped out in waiting areas. Angela began to explain, this hospital serves the East End community working families, people who can't afford to go to private clinics. Most of them don't have insurance, and we don't turn anyone away. Rachel scribbled notes as Angela continued. We've been overwhelmed for weeks. People started getting sick, and it spread faster here than anywhere else. By the time the vaccine came out, we were told there wasn't enough to go around. Not a single dose was sent here. And the crate? Rachel asked. Angela paused, choosing her words carefully. It showed up anonymously. We don't know where it came from. But we didn't ask questions because we didn't have the luxury to. We used it to save lives. Rachel looked up. And Dr. Brooks? Angela's expression softened. Ethan's the reason this hospital is still holding on. He's been fighting every day, fighting for his patients, for the community. He was the one who spoke up when no one else would. And now he's been punished for it. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her voice steady. So you're telling me that the man trying to save lives has been suspended? Angela nodded, her anger bubbling to the surface. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Rachel stopped walking and turned to face her. Does Dr. Brooks know I'm here? Angela hesitated. No, he doesn't. Rachel smiled faintly. Maybe it's time he did. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment, staring blankly at the newspaper spread before him. He hadn't been able to return to the hospital since the suspension, and the silence was driving him mad. The phone calls from Angela and the other nurses helped, but they weren't enough to dull the feeling that he'd abandoned his patients. The knock at his door startled him. He stood slowly and opened it to find Angela standing there, her arms crossed and a determined look on her face. Beside her stood Rachel Murphy, holding her notebook. What's this? Ethan asked, his voice flat. You're not hiding anymore, Angela said firmly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Ethan turned to Rachel, his brow furrowed. And you are? Rachel Murphy, Channel 7 News, she said, extending her hand. Ethan ignored it, looking at Angela instead. What are you doing? She's here to tell your story, Angela said. Our story, the one people need to hear. Ethan shook his head. This isn't the time for interviews. Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm but insistent. Dr. Brooks, I know you don't trust me, but hear me out. I've seen what's happening at East End Hospital. I've seen what you and your team have done to save lives. The world needs to know what's happening there. How the system is failing people, like your patients. Ethan stared at her, his jaw tight. And then what? A news story won't get us the resources we need. Rachel met his gaze evenly. Maybe not, but it'll make sure no one can ignore you anymore. It'll shine a light on the truth, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. Ethan looked at Angela, who nodded in quiet support. For a long moment, He didn't speak. He thought about Marcus, about Tasha's tear-streaked face, about the crate of vaccines that had appeared like a miracle. He thought about Eleanor Hayes and the state health officials, more worried about rules than saving lives. Finally, he let out a breath. "Fine," he said. "Let's talk." 2 days later, the East End story hit the airwaves. The footage was raw and unpolished. Rachel's camera crew had captured the packed waiting rooms, the makeshift treatment zones, the nurses working tirelessly to keep up. Families shared stories of waiting hours, sometimes days, for care. A mother spoke tearfully about her son, who had died before the vaccines arrived. But the center of the story was Ethan. The interview showed him sitting in his apartment, his voice steady but full of restrained emotion. "The system is broken," he said simply. "Hospitals like East End are being forgotten. The people who need care the most are the ones being pushed aside." When Rachel asked him about the vaccine crate, his response was clear. "I don't know who sent it, but whoever did saved lives. That crate gave us hope when we had nothing left." The story ended with footage of Marcus. The boy was sitting up in bed, his breathing easier now. His mother, Tasha, stood beside him, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "Dr. Brooks saved my son's life," she said. "He gave us hope. I just want to know, why don't we matter as much as everyone else?" The story spread like wildfire. It aired on local stations, then national ones. Social media exploded with clips of Ethan's interview, hashtags demanding justice for East End. Donations began pouring in: money, medical supplies, and letters of support from across the country. At East End Hospital, families watched the story on a small TV in the waiting room, tears streaming down their faces. Volunteers moved through the halls with renewed energy, their heads held high. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense that change might finally be coming. In his apartment, Ethan's phone began ringing off the hook: reporters, community leaders, and even state officials calling to discuss the situation. Angela called him late that night, her voice full of emotion. "Ethan, you did it. People are listening now." Ethan stared out the window at the city he had fought so hard for. "It's not over yet," he said softly. But for the first time, he believed they might just win. The morning after the news story aired, East End Hospital was different. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere buzzed with something beyond desperation. There was hope. Donations had started arriving overnight. Boxes of medical supplies, bottled water, masks, and even new oxygen tanks were stacked near the entrance, waiting to be sorted. Ethan Brooks walked through the front doors, unsure of what to expect. He had returned to work the moment the health department backed down, pressured by the public outcry, sparked by Rachel Murphy's story. Eleanor Hayes hadn't spoken to him directly, but her silence was victory enough. "Dr. Brooks!" A nurse's voice caught his attention, and he turned to see Angela hurrying toward him. Behind her, volunteers carried boxes into the hospital, while patients watched with quiet smiles. Angela grinned as she stopped in front of him. "You've got to see this." Ethan followed her into the waiting room, where a crowd had gathered near the television. The news was playing again, but this time the focus was different. In response to mounting public pressure, health officials have pledged immediate vaccine shipments to underserved communities, including East End Hospital, the anchor announced. An initial delivery is expected within hours, with additional resources to follow. Cheers erupted in the room. A teenage boy clapped his hands while an elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes. Ethan stood in the doorway, the weight on his chest finally lifting. Angela turned to him, her voice soft but proud. "You did it, Ethan. They heard us." Ethan shook his head. "We did it. All of us." The vaccines arrived later that afternoon, more than enough to cover the patients waiting at East End Hospital. Nurses worked tirelessly to organize the doses, ensuring those in critical condition were treated first. Ethan moved through the halls, watching as people received their shots with tears of relief. When he entered Marcus's room, the boy was sitting up in bed, holding a juice box. He looked stronger, still pale, but with a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Tasha stood beside him, smiling brightly. "Look who's awake," Ethan said, a grin tugging at his lips. Marcus looked up and managed a faint smile. "Hey, Doc?" "You're looking better, buddy," Ethan said, sitting beside the bed. "How do you feel?" "Less like garbage," Marcus replied, his voice clearer than before. Tasha laughed softly, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks. You saved him." Ethan shook his head gently. "He's strong, that's what saved him. I just gave him a little help." Tasha placed a hand over her heart. "You gave us hope. That's everything." Ethan smiled, the warmth spreading through him. For all the battles they had fought, this was the moment that made it worth it. As the sun began to set, Ethan stood outside the hospital entrance, looking out over the East End streets. Volunteers waved goodbye to families who had received treatment, and neighbors stopped to thank nurses as they left their shifts. There was still work to be done, but the sense of victory hung in the air. Angela joined him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Long day." Ethan took the cup and nodded. "Yeah, but a good one." Angela sipped her coffee, watching the quiet hum of the community around them. "You know, people are still talking about you, about what you did." Ethan shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "It's not about me. It's about all of them, Mr. Thompson, Tasha, Marcus, the volunteers. This happened because we stood together." Angela nodded, her voice soft. "It's still something, Ethan. You gave them a reason to fight." Ethan looked at her, his smile widening. "They gave me one too." That evening, the story of East End Hospital continued to spread. On the news, headlines highlighted the community's perseverance. Social media buzzed with messages of support. People shared Ethan's words, his fight, and the hope it sparked. Before leaving the hospital for the night, Ethan stood in the doorway and looked back. Families huddled together in the waiting room. Nurses laughed softly as they passed, and patients rested in their rooms with a new sense of peace. This was what he had been fighting for. The system wasn't fixed overnight, and there were still battles ahead. But tonight, Ethan allowed himself to feel the weight of their victory. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he whispered to himself, "We're not forgotten anymore." The story of East End reminds us that hope lives in the smallest of actions, in a helping hand, in a voice that refuses to be silenced, and in the strength of a community that stands together. If this story touched you, remember that change begins with all of us. Stand up for what's right, fight for those who can't, and never lose hope even when the odds seem impossible. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Together, we can share stories that inspire kindness, perseverance, and hope. Thank you for being here.